Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. Welcome to UNFCCC's Coordination Hubs webinar today. Today's theme is, as we announced, concentrated corporate power in the global food systems, consequences and potential policy responses. And we will first, we have the director of the hub, Dr. Stefanos Fati, welcoming remarks. And then we are very happy listening Dr. Jennifer Clapp's groundbreaking books on titled Titans of Industrial Agriculture. Then we will have a Right to Food special rapporteur, have some remarks about the book, and then we have the panel discussion. Thank you for coming and listening to us. Here is the Stefanos Fati.
Thank you very much, Professor Ervel, and very welcome from me to all of you for this webinar. I really feel very privileged that we hosting together with the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Hub this webinar in one of the issues that I think it's becoming more and more one of the central issues when we're asking the question, why food system transformations towards sustainably resilient systems do not happen? And I think one of the big issues is that we have this power concentration that we are going to explore today in our webinar. I'm not an expert on this. We have experts here. We have Jennifer and we have other colleagues. And so I'm not going to talk about the concentration of power and what entails and how it happens and what the negative impacts. But I'm going to talk about another thing. I'm going to say that we have moved a level beyond a concentration of power that it's affecting the food systems. And we're talking about the power to silence, the influence and the limits of public discourse when someone is talking about this issue. It happens to become something like a taboo that anyone that is talking about this thing about the corporate power should be silenced. So the concentration of corporate power has reached a level where open discussion about its consequences is often constrained or discouraged. And I find this extremely against the current era of information that we are living. So this phenomenon is a testament to the outside influence that a handful of interests they yield worldwide. It's not just over the markets, over the supply chains, but over the very narratives that they shape the public understanding and policy. And I think we need to preserve all the different narratives that they shape this public understanding and policy. I come from biological science that they coupled with economics, but I'm a strong believer of the concept of diversity. In biology, we believe that biological diversity is what makes the systems resilient. So in our social and economic system, we want a diversity of ideas. And we want to have the means and the rules that they keep this diversity. So we want to keep mechanisms that they keep this diversity. And that's why I was very pleased when the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Hub suggested that we do this webinar, because I think that we contribute to this diversity. And I think that the more the discussion is becoming open, the more the discussion is involving science, policymaker, grassroots, stakeholders, the better it will be for all of us. I want to say that despite the challenge that we face today, it is essential to protect the spaces for this critical reflection. And I think that it's part of the role of multilateral institutions and academia to ensure that these diverse perspectives are heard. We need to acknowledge and confront the effect of the concentrated power, and we can hope to build food systems that are truly sustainable, just, and resilient, not because we just address the issue, but because we have also solutions. And I think today we do have a number of solutions. I hope that we will hear a lot of them in the webinar, but I'm seeing increasing scientific work that says, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. I'm looking at work that even is touching the narratives of international organizations they talked about strengthening antitrust and competition policies, about supporting smallholders and diversified food systems, about promoting transparency and accountability, and about encouraging innovation for sustainability. So let me close this small opening by saying that I perceive change as an evolutionary process. And in the evolutionary processes, we do have something that we call a mutation. Many times mutation in biology happen for bad reasons. Cancers are mutations. But many times why we are thriving today as a human species is because we had some mutations that evolved us. And I do hope that the work like the one that Jennifer and other colleagues are putting together is the genes that they will drive these positive mutations. So thank you very much for all the contribution on this, and I will be staying online for the entire hour to listen to this very informative webinar. Back to you, Hila.
Thank you, Dr. Fatih. It was a very short but very interesting remarks about the silencing, conflict of interest, and diversity of the ideas. That's what I pick. The three of them are for us is extremely important. Now we are coming the Professor Jennifer Clapp's presentation. We all know Jennifer's very well, and her bio is in the chat. And without any further ado, we would like to listen to her fantastic work that we are very happy to all together listening her. Thank you. You have 15 minutes. Hopefully, I will remind you at the end. If you have a few minutes, I will give you a few minutes more. Thank you. You are muted, Jennifer.
There we go. Thank you very much, Hilal, and thank you, Stefanos, for those comments, and thank you, Shakuntala, for the invitation to be here today to speak about some of my work on concentrated corporate power in the global food system and its consequences and policy responses. So I was asked to speak to my new book, Titans of Industrial Agriculture, as well as a recent co-authored publication with colleagues that came out in Food Policy a couple of weeks ago. And these works are about the problem that Stefanos outlined, the problem of a handful of large corporations playing a big part across food systems, and the fact that their presence gives them a considerable amount of power and generates uneven power dynamics that matter for food systems outcomes. And so, when we talk about why should we focus on corporate concentration and power in food systems, well, it's because corporate concentration, it's a persistent pattern across food systems with heightened consolidation in recent decades that really matters for how food systems play out in practice and matter for people on an everyday basis. Concentrated markets, and it matters because concentrated markets are associated with inequities and also uneven power dynamics that affect people's agency. In other words, people's ability to shape their own relationship to food systems, be it as producers or as consumers. And so for these reasons, it's really vital for us to understand both the drivers and the implications of corporate concentration and power in food systems, especially as they matter for the right to food, for livelihoods, and also the natural environment. And so I'm going to speak first to some of the big themes and arguments that I make in The Titans of Industrial Agriculture, which is a book about the agricultural input industry, specifically looking at the farm machinery sector, fertilizers, seeds, and pesticides. And then I'll say a few words about the new food policy article, which zooms out and takes a much bigger look at food systems as a whole and the role of corporate concentration and power in it. So first, in talking about Titans of Industrial Agriculture, I began work on this book after a suite of giant mergers and acquisitions took place in the agricultural input sector that completely reconfigured the landscape after 2015. And this included Dow and DuPont announcing a big merger in 2015, which spun out a joint agricultural inputs firm called Corteva, which is now one of the biggest chemical and seed companies in the world. Then ChemChina announced it was going to acquire Syngenta in early 2016, and then it merged into Sinochem, one of the biggest Chinese chemical companies, and then Bayer acquired Monsanto. also now, Monsanto under the name Bayer, which is also one of the big companies. And then the corporation BASF, which was a big pesticide producer, stood ready to buy a bunch of the parts of the other firms that regulators required them to spin off. And now it's also a big seed and chemical and seed company. And in the meantime, what was going on, it was that two of the biggest fertilizer companies in the world, Agrium and Potash Corporation, merged to form Nutrien in 2016. And then in the background, we saw the large machinery companies buying up all kinds of startups in digital and genomic technologies. And so what we started to see then is this reconfiguration and consolidation in the sector. So what we ended up with is today, just the top 4 firms in each of the major input sectors control a significant share of those markets, both globally and in national context. So for example, in the top 4 companies in seeds control around 50 to 60% of that global market. And in North America and in many other countries, they control even more. So for example, there's something like 15 countries, 4 companies control more than 80% of maize seeds, and similarly, soy, canola, et cetera, in the countries that produce those crops. Those same 4 companies also control around 60 to 70% of global pesticide sales. When we're looking at farm machinery, the top 4 companies control around 50% of the global market, but again, it's more pronounced nationally. So in North America, for example, just one company, John Deere, controls around 60% of heavy-duty tractor sales. And then when we're talking about fertilizers, we don't really have good figures globally, but we know that nationally it's very concentrated. So for example, in North America, 100% of the potash is controlled by just 2 firms, and 4 firms control around 75% of the nitrogen fertilizer production. So it's concentrated, and this matters because when, as economists point out, when the market concentration of the top 4 firms exceeds 40%, then market distortions are more likely to occur. Suboptimal outcomes can happen because of those market distortions, and that's really about these power imbalances and inequities that result. So in terms of like why I wanted to write this book, I wanted to understand how we got to this position where, these inputs weren't even market commodities 200 years ago, and now they're controlled by a tiny handful of companies. So what drove this concentration, and what can we do about it? So in terms of the research for this particular book, I took a really historical perspectives because I realized you couldn't understand the concentration in the sector today without understanding how the, inputs became commodified in the first place and what were the early companies that started to produce these inputs. So I looked, I love this slide because it's got the advertising of a lot of the early companies that were involved across all of the input sectors. And it's just fascinating to me that although some of the names here might not be familiar to you, like Funk Brothers or Royster or even McCormick, those companies are like the lineage traces from those companies to the ones that are in power today. So there was a process of mergers and acquisitions that led to this concentration. So I wanted to understand in the book, I'm trying to argue or understand how they became so big in the first place. I try to understand, how they utilize power and then why it matters. So in terms of this first part of what I'm looking at, I was trying to understand what drove the mergers and acquisitions that led these few companies today to be so dominant. And I outline these complex drivers in a lot of detail. The book is over 400 pages, so I'm going to give the quick version here. The first big thing that I talk about are the economic and financial dynamics that drive concentration in the sector, like things like economies of scale. The corporations want you to believe economies of scale are the main reason that they got big, or that they're clever and they're innovative, and it just makes more sense for them to be big. But it's more complicated than that, because of course economies of scale matter in some cases, but so does privileged access to finance, financiers, and investors. So does the way that financial investors pressure firms to make change based on economic cycles, like the agricultural boom and bust cycles, which we know as scholars of food and agriculture are quite powerful forces that really can affect fortunes and misfortunes in the sector because of the volatility of commodity prices. And so when we see these kind of economic dynamics come together, it is a combination of scale with financial and investment pressures that have led to acquisitions and mergers along the way. And I want to stress too that I found that this is not just a recent process. This has been going on almost since the beginning of the commodification and establishment of major firms in the sector. So for example, in 1902, there was a massive merger of 7 farm machinery firms in the US that gave the resulting firm 85% of the farm machinery market. So concentration is long-standing, and it's driven in big part by these economic dynamics. And it's a similar story across the other inputs. But technological change also really matters. Technological change often spurs these mergers and acquisitions to happen. This includes transformative innovations both inside and outside of the sector. For example, like the synthesis of nitrogen from natural gas, or the development of hybrid seeds, even the invention of the mechanical reaper. Like these kinds of transformative technological changes often lead corporations to merge and acquire one another, but they have other things as well. I mean, they're doing this mergers and acquisitions in part because of the lure of patent protection. So they want protection for their technologies to keep others out of the market. And they also tend to drive technological lock-ins. In other words, you're not going to just pick up one piece of the industrial agricultural model. You're going to pick all of it up. And that benefits those firms and leads to those kind of concentrations. And then we have to also consider the policy context. Many of the firms that grew big had direct government support. They had subsidies, or they benefited from government research and development. They had other kinds of handouts that enabled them to become big and powerful. The hybrid seed industry is a prime example that technology was developed by the US government, and then basically those corporations were able to take government research, make a few changes, and then it kept everyone else out of the market. And then they pushed and pressured government to get out of the business of seed research, to leave the market to themselves. So these complex drivers all really matter for understanding concentration. And I realize the time is whipping by quickly, so I'll speed it up. But I just wanted to give one example. This is just an example from the book about how the mergers and acquisitions in the pesticide industry played out from the 1800s and early 1900s to today. And you can see there's considerable consolidation along the way. I trace all the other sectors in the book as well. So a second key argument that I talk about is that concentration lends different kinds of power to the companies that get big. So once they get big, they are able to shape markets through their influence over supply and demand because they are so big. They're able to shape policy and governance because they have the power to lobby policymakers and use other means to influence the policy context, as Stefanos was saying, by shaping discourses and other methods like supporting research and development. And then they also have the power to shape technological trajectories. In other words, the technologies they choose are the ones that tend to be dominant because those firms are already dominant. And so they have these kinds of powers that interlock with one another. And you'll note that they mirror the very drivers that got them big in the first place. So in a way, it's self-perpetuating cycle because they are able to shape the very forces that let them stay big and powerful. And so there are all kinds of implications from this kind of concentration of corporate power. In the input sector, it gives them this kind of market power, technology power, and political power that has all kinds of effects. And I recognize with the time, I don't have a lot of time to go through all of these, but it's important.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. But it affects prices that farmers pay for their inputs. It affects the ability of other companies to get into the business. It shapes innovations in ways that continue to be profit maximizing and not necessarily best for the public interest. And it leads to undue corporate influence on the policy process that basically can undermine democratic participation in the sector. And so just quickly, some examples, when we have higher prices, it can threaten farmer livelihoods and make food more expensive for consumers. Farmers can lose autonomy due to technological lock-ins and also become de-skilled because of the seeds, pesticides, and machinery have become so complex and in a way, taking away the ability of farmers to make their own choices. The pursuit of profit-oriented innovations also spurs, further technological lock-ins that make it very difficult to transition to more sustainable farming systems. And it has encouraged a continued reliance on herbicide-centric models that threaten environment and health. So again, I don't have time to go into the examples, but I want to shift quickly in my last minute to talk about the recent paper with colleagues, including Nitya Rao, who's on the call today, about this way in which this kind of concentration, it's not just in the input sector, it's across the entire food system, not just production, but also trade, retail, and processing. And so you can see here, we've got high concentration in the soft drink industry, in the grain trade, in the banana trade, in the cocoa trade, and poultry breeding. And this is at the global level. But again, when you shift to the national and subnational level, it can be even more concentrated. We see, as I mentioned already, in over 15 countries, 80% of the maize seed is controlled by just 4 firms. But at grocery retail, also highly concentrated across many countries. In Canada, just 5 firms hold around 80% of the market. And again, I'm not going to go into this data, but you can find this paper online if you want to look at it. But I want to talk just briefly about the way in which the paper maps these kinds of power and again, the consequences, because it's really important for us to understand that corporate dominance and power in the food system gives this power to shape markets, raising prices. And then when we look more broadly, we see that these firms have the capacity to lower wages and also to lower the prices they pay to suppliers. And it puts farmers in a unique position where they are actually having to buy more expensive inputs, but at the same time, they have very little power to bargain with the buyers of their products. And so they are being squeezed on both ends. And it also creates barriers to entry for new firms to enter the market. These corporations are lobbying directly. They're engaging in revolving door, toggling between policy and government positions and working in corporations that have influenced policy. But they also affect discourse and scientific scholarship by sponsoring research. And then they also have the power to shape what we call material conditions in food systems. So they're able to shape the kinds of products that end up on supermarket shelves, which matters for food environments. It matters for diets. It matters for health. They shape also working and production conditions in farm fields and in processing. And they're also, as I mentioned already, shaping technological trajectories. So there are multiple pathways by which people's choices and their agency is affected by corporate power. And I just will pause here, if Hilal will give me one extra second, to mention that most of the studies that we see coming from economics are focused almost entirely on the price effects of concentration. And what we're trying to argue is it goes far beyond price effects to affect people's agency and ability to make choices within food systems, which, as Stefano said, affects these questions of diversity, power, and the ability to transform food systems. So just very quickly, we need stronger competition policies to prevent this kind of excessive market power. We have to reduce political influence. We have to increase public support for alternative food systems based on solidarity and sustainability. That's the diversity Stefanos was talking about. And we have to support negotiations on a binding treaty on TNCs and human rights. And of course, we have to improve the data availability. And I say all this because I do make the case that the voluntary frameworks alone are not enough to rectify these problems. We need strong public policy to get there. I look forward to the discussion. I say, and thank you very much. And I figured out yesterday, I was so proud of myself, how to make QR codes for the book and also for the article. So if you have your cell phone available, you can quickly reach the websites for these publications. And I will stop there. I'm sorry I went over a little bit, Hilal, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. It was fantastic. We cannot stop you here. Every single moments were very important. Why is concentrated market in food system is important? Because food systems are too many sectors together. It's not concentration of media, or it's not concentration of finance. This is entire our lifestyle concentrated, because it's extremely important. So now we have Professor Michael Fahri, UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. He has a short video answering or commenting on Jennifer's presentation and her book. Okay, good.
Hello, my name is Michael Fakhri, and I am the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to Jennifer Clapp's new book. I wish I could be with you in real time. However, due to the significant time difference, I can only send this recording instead. Let me begin by saying that Dr. Clapp's book is really remarkable and couldn't be more timely. It's a thorough study of the rise of corporate power in terms of agricultural inputs in North America and Europe. However, the framework and ideas that Dr. Clapp puts forward, I think, can be used to understand the rise of corporate power and the concentration of power in the hands of a few corporations is relevant for across the food system and not just for agricultural inputs. And I think there are lessons also to be learned in terms of corporate dominance in countries in all over the world. Many of these corporations are transnational corporations and have a global outlook in how they understand their business. What makes this work very timely and important in relation to the Food Systems Summit is the fact that the Food Systems Summit never really framed what is the problem in clear terms. You know, what was really important about the Food Systems Summit and what it achieved in a significant way is it put the issue of food system transformation on the international agenda. And that's incredibly important in light of the rise in greenhouse gases and climate change, the degradation of biodiversity, increasing rates of hunger and starvation, I'll add. And so the issue of food system transformation is more important than ever. However, there is no international consensus around what is the problem. And I think Professor Clapp's work really highlights and frames that question very clearly. At the heart of the issue of whether it is greenhouse gases, biodiversity degradation, pollution, malnutrition, hunger, famine, really at the heart of it is a story of this rise of corporate power and the concentration of power in our food systems in the hands of a few people and a few entities. Because as Professor Clapp shows in this book, the problem when you have power concentrated in the hands of just a few, then we have markets that are not working properly. We don't have a fair system of governance. Instead, what we have is, in effect, an oligarchy, meaning a small number of players exercise a significant amount of political and economic power. They shape what foods are actually available for people, what foods are promoted, and what kind of foods people eat. I've heard the foods that many transnational corporations produce, I've heard some people describe them as edible commodities instead of actual nutritious and healthy food. And I think that's quite right. Because what's the problem again is this concentration of power. And why? Why did this happen? There's something about the corporate form itself that enables individuals to concentrate and hold so much power in our food systems. First, remember, corporations are driven by profits. That's their primary purpose. Despite all of what they might say about sustainability or human rights or whatever, more often than not, that's either marketing or it's too superficial to actually affect real change in the rest of the world. So corporations are market-driven, are profit-driven. Second, corporations by design are created to avoid liability and to limit liability. That's the purpose of a corporation, is to amass and organize resources in a way that protects individuals from being held liable. That's in the corporate form. As people, we can organize our wealth and resources in a wide range of ways, but the corporate form protects individuals from liability. And so what is needed, I think, coming up in the Food Systems Summit is a focus on governance and human rights. And from the beginning, from 2021, when we had that first food system summit 4 years ago, and consistently, many of us have been pushing for the issue of governance, corporate power, and human rights to be the central core issue of the food system summit, because this goes to the heart of the matter. Before we talk about sustainability, before we talk about climate change, and before we talk about biodiversity degradation and nutritious food, really, this is what is the problem. I congratulate Dr. Clapp on such a fine work that will generate rich conversation. I wish you all the best, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It's very important, of course, his messages always. Limited liability and the voluntarism, combination of the two, that shows that how difficult a kind of accountability systems could be implemented in this limiting, or not even limiting, but controlling the corporations' strong power. So now our panelists will discuss further what kind of power and what kind of system failure will have through this important development in our time. Our first panelist will be Professor Nitya Rao. Again, I'm not giving the all long kind of bio, but all our panelists are part of the Hub Advisory Committee Council, which is what we call SAC. They are all the SAC members. Will be a kind of, this webinar is a kind of family webinar. First, we start from Nitya. Here, Nitya, you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hilal. And thank you so much, Jennifer. And congratulations also on the book. And you've set out so clearly about how corporate concentration intensifies power imbalances in the food systems and affecting a range of stakeholders, smallholder farmers, food system workers, consumers, and also through the multiple ways, as you emphasized, through commodity prices, through wages, through food environments, and so on. I think in a recent review paper that we published, I think parallel to the one that you mentioned in food policy, and I think this gives me a little bit hope that I think alongside the corporate concentration, we're also finding a rise in food activism and citizen voice, seeking to promote some alternatives, seeking to promote just and sustainable, people-centered alternatives. And especially in global organizations like, I think, the UNFSS Hub, there is the SENA group trying to bring in the diverse voices. Stefanos mentioned it. The CFS, the Committee on World Food Security, is again a good example, which tries to bring on board diverse voices to balance some of this unequal power. But having said that, I think you're absolutely right in that, even where citizens exercise voice, I think we are very much dependent on states and state responses. And in today's context of growing corporate influence, I think there are clearly limits to state power. And I think during COVID, the example of delivery workers in Italy was a case in point, where there were initial efforts at dialogue and concessions to the workers' union, but ultimately the sort of aggregator platforms refused to accept these concessions, and the state kind of backed off. So I think even where there is change, I think you're absolutely right in saying that these changes are partial, and they're often aimed at appeasing activists rather than addressing the systemic issues. And we know that food systems, are not all right. They are very unequal. 733 million people are still undernourished, and we are not on track to achieving SDG 2. So I just wanted to make a few remarks on, how we might move towards an agenda that places, tries to push forward equity and justice and agency. And I think one point is taken from you, parallel to the concentration of corporates. I think we also need to build international solidarity and coalitions across geographies in terms of also the scaling up of citizen voice, if you like, in terms of creating stronger structures and higher levels of engagement. Of course, this needs resources, and I think this is often often a problem. But where there has been this kind of international solidarity, I think an interesting example comes from Mali, where the peasants were struggling for seed rights through both legal action and grassroots mobilization. And here I think the international solidarity of the seed networks really helped push the state towards both policy change and implementation. I think the second point, which Michael Fakhri just made as well, about the importance of food system governance, and particularly decentralization and democratization of food systems governance. And I think this was also highlighted by another of our SAC members, Schengen Fan, in the webinar last week, that we really need to localize, democratize, decentralize governance and give voice again to different actors, whether it's government, whether it is CSOs, whether it is grassroots movements, not only, the entry into the door, as you said, of the corporates. The third thing I think, which is becoming highly contentious, and I think you referred to it in terms of the economic and the financial, is that access to land and other productive resources, be it credit, markets. This is one of the most significant challenges for food sovereignty movements who are seeking to achieve the broader objectives of sustainable farming and food security. And I think there have recently been calls actually for a more robust global framework on new human rights that also moves beyond the sort of established human rights, but really includes things like rights to land and territory as part of new human rights. So just two other very small points. One is a social justice approach. I think there was a question as well that said that how do we move towards this? So I think well established in social justice approaches are sort of three dimensions of social justice. One is recognition, that entails that, first step is recognizing that the world is not equal, that there are these power dynamics, whether it's by wealth, social group, gender, etc. The second thing, and I think the food systems pathways, actually, I haven't gone into a lot of this detail looking at it, but I think Stefanos, it's quite interesting from a few of them that they do recognize in some countries special policies for youth or special policies for women and so on, recognizing these as disadvantaged groups. The second thing is around...
Should we wrap up? Would be good.
Yeah. Can I have another couple of seconds?
Yeah.
Okay, just half a minute more. The second
Okay,
element
good.
is redistribution of resources, and of course representation, which I've already spoken about in terms of governance and so on. And my final point, because I myself work on gender and gender justice a lot, that I think we need to recognize also that women are increasingly burdened with the responsibility of ensuring food security and nutrition, with few resources and very little voice in decision making across scales, right from the household to the global and the corporate context. And I think for me, an additional way forward to achieving justice is not just the rights to food, which was emphasized, but also I think a responsibility of states to invest resources in social infrastructure that can support gender equality. So thank you very much, Hilal.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nitya. Now we have Barbara Burlingame comes from, I think you are now New Zealand, right?
Currently, no, but in a few months, yes, again.
Okay, great. And so here, Barbara, it's your turn. In 5 minutes, you wrap up your approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hilal. I want to talk a little bit about rights-based approaches versus corporate capture of food systems. So very much along the lines of Jennifer's book and what we're talking about in today's webinar. The rights-based approach is something that we see, depending on the rights we're talking about, many violations by corporate entities, whether we're talking about human rights implications and the many actions of the corporate entities in food systems, whether it's from the production end or the consumption end, actions that contravene multiple human rights. The right to food, as discussed by Michael Fakhri, the special rapporteur, many violations related to the 6 dimensions of food security, most particularly, including what Jennifer mentioned, the dimension of agency and also the dimension of sustainability. Something we don't talk about that much in food systems, but is very relevant and needs to be part of policy frameworks is the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. Breastfeeding is part of food systems, and there's a long history of violations since the International Code was adopted in 1981. Those violations continue to today. Then there are the collective and community rights related to UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Peasants and rural people. In the food system arena, it's land grabbing, it's forced evictions, it's environmental degradation, as speakers have mentioned already. It's erosion of seed sovereignty, knowledge systems, and autonomy over food systems. And then there's the rights of nature, which is not fully embedded into many policy frameworks, including the UN, but it is represented explicitly in the constitutions of some countries, and it is implied in many of these other rights frameworks. And that is that ecosystems and natural communities have the fundamental right to exist, to thrive, and regenerate. And this is especially important in that we are currently in the middle of the UN International Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And this is very much a food systems issue. I want to give two examples and then I'll finish. The first is related to a declaration made by Indigenous youth. It was the Global Declaration on Sustainable and Resilient Food Systems. And in this declaration, they are making an international call to prioritize production and consumption of local and traditional foods from Indigenous peoples' food systems. And they say that we must appeal to the importance of our traditional Indigenous foods as an instrument of effective expression of our food sovereignty in action. And they called for coordinated efforts of Indigenous youth around the world to reduce and even eliminate the consumption of ultra-processed foods. A product of corporate food systems, which have devastating effects on the health of Indigenous peoples, but not just Indigenous peoples, and devastating effects on the maintenance of their ancestral food practices. The other example I want to mention comes from the furtherance of the UN Food Systems Summit, and it's from a national pathway where a policy document has incorporated many of these rights for achieving food security and sustainable food systems. The example I'm using is from Hungary, and it's from their National Pathways document. Hungary considers it essential to target the root causes of poverty and inequality, social exclusion, and to leave no one behind. They consider that the universal rights, specifically the right to food, the right to healthy environments, to social protection, education, and culture, are key to social and economic inclusion for all, and to address the structural root causes of hunger. They say technology and other innovations are necessary, but not enough, and structural changes are essential, addressing power imbalances, which is the subject of today's webinar, and conflicts of interest for better corporate accountability. In this respect, we should provide policy incentives to promote food systems that are really, truly sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. And now we have the last panelist. I don't know if he arrived or not, but...
Hi, Hilal. He unfortunately is not with us.
Oh, okay. Then we have a little bit of time. We can be much more answer the question, which is okay. And just summarizing Nitya's and Barbara's presentation, it was important because after Michael Fahri, that he was focusing on the limited responsibility, and the Nitya answer against the corporate concentration as a counter power of the food activism and the international solidarity movement is extremely important. And she mentions a little bit more about the new rights, which means right to food, although individuals, one of the individuals' rights, but now through the food sovereignty, I think right concept is not anymore protection of the individuals, but protection of the community, which Barbara came with the more focusing on the indigenous people and most vulnerable groups, that we have to really focus on the impact of the global giants versus the groups that they are trying to protect their rights or at least raise the voices. And the importance of agency is the raising the voices, and importance of sustainability. We connect it with the right to nature. So now human rights is not anymore completely anthropocentric, but it's going to be the ecocentric. Without the nature rights, we will not be able to speak about the right to food and individuals' right. So having all this fantastic presentation, and the national pathways is the UN food systems kind of important policy. Hopefully in July, we will see the very important examples there. Now we have to come to the questions. I think Nicole is going to help me, because I was listening to the panel. I was not able to look at the questions. Yes,
Okay.
thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. Oh, and I have the easy job, which is just bringing all these difficult questions to our panelists. And some I see that Jennifer already replied to one. I see a bit of 4, and feel free if we have a bit of time if you want to put things on the Q&A. But first, someone is saying, how can we dismantle the corporate hold on food systems to ensure this greater justice and more equitable distribution of power? That's the essence that why we are here, a very broad question. Another person saying, what systems level interventions have been implemented to enhance food security? Another one, can we talk about the role of international organizations? Somebody saying the UN, the World Bank sometimes partner with these corporations to create value chains that bring smallholder farmers in developing countries into global supply chains, which are controlled by these large companies, and encourage them to grow anonymous commodities rather than local crops that contribute to greater biodiversity. So what the solutions can be offered instead? And 2 questions here is about this power imbalances, that if they're so key, why are they not being so central on the agenda of the UNFCCC+4? And what can be, I think a big question for all of us, what can be done differently this time? So all very simple questions. I don't know who would like to start, but over to you, Hilal.
I think we should start from Jennifer, because how to dismantle them. This is what she wrote 400 pages book. So I think you start, and the role of international organization, then other panelists will jump into whatever they would like to add.
Thank you, Hilal, and thanks to the audience for the excellent and challenging questions. These are challenging questions, and I just wanted to reiterate the importance of because they're challenging, we can't just ignore them. We need to grapple with them. We need to take them on, even though they can be very difficult to address. But the first one on how we dismantle the corporate hold on the food system. I mean, I know I was racing through the end of my presentation, but I do discuss this in the book, and we discuss it in our paper, that it requires a multi-pronged approach that is not just within the food system. Like, we're not going to solve corporate power in food systems only through food policy. That's not going to happen. We have to tackle the problem of corporate power more broadly in the global political economy, because it matters across not just the food system, but many other sectors. And that includes really strong competition policies to prevent the mergers and acquisitions, and in some cases were warranted to break up large firms that have so much power. But that alone isn't enough. In the food system, we need to have support for more diverse and less corporate-oriented food systems, policies that support economies for production and for trade of food that is more diverse, that is more based on solidarity principles, that recognizes that food has much more in terms of a role in society than just as a market commodity. It is important for culture, it's important for nourishment, it's important for community and for environmental services. So we need to make sure that we support food in all its dimensions and all its roles through more diverse food system policies. So for example, promotion of agroecology, which is much more environmentally sound, based on supporting people's agency and voice, as well as territorial markets that are more connected to their local communities and are more environmentally sound. So those are just two examples. And I would reiterate as well what Nitya was saying. If we're not seeing, if the state is captured and not taking that role, that needs to be taken up by citizens groups, by civil society, and really push for this kind of change, take matters into communities' own hands when the state won't do it. But we need to do this through more democratic participation broadly, as well as in food systems, to improve governance. And address conflicts of interest, as Michael said, as Barbara said. So I really appreciate those comments. And also I appreciate the comment on the role of international organizations. Just briefly, I'll say when we see big international organizations, the World Bank, et cetera, even the FAO making partnerships with these big companies, they really, it raises all kinds of questions about whose interests are dominating in those initiatives. And we need to make sure that the public interest dominates in those initiatives, that civil society is playing a role. We can't have just these voluntary kind of corporate suggested solutions, because they are, as Michael said, they're bound to the interests of their shareholders. They're bound to the profit motive as opposed to the broader motive. That's not to say they can't do things that are good, but there's no way to make sure that happens short of some sort of state enforced kind of agreement. That's why we need to really push for that legally binding treaty on transnational corporations and human rights, which will matter for the food system. Anyway, I'll stop. I've talked for too long, but I really appreciate the questions and feedback.
Yes, you came to the very important point, how corporate responsibility dealing with the international agreement, which has been doing maybe more than 10, 15 years, discussed by Geneva, but they don't go one step further. Unfortunately, European Union and the United States is very much against such a big agreement. So all these things that the results kind of brings us human rights-based approach, how should be very effective and helpful making the significant imbalances little bit of better way. Let's, Nitya or Barbara, don't forget there is an important question here, power imbalances, why in UNFCCC? This is a very good question. Anybody would like to answer this, or Barbara or Nitya, who is starting first?
So I won't answer that. Maybe Stefanos or somebody from or yourself could answer the UNFSS question.
Stefanos, maybe.
But I wanted to pick up on the system level. I think there was a question on what are the system level interventions to address food security. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right, Hilal, in emphasizing that we do need to start with a rights-based approach. I just wanted to say that India is an example where there was a campaign by the Right to Food campaign for almost 10 years till they finally got a right to food legislation in Parliament. And actually that's really helped hold the government to account in terms of different dimensions, of food security. So that doesn't relate to the whole food system, but definitely in terms of recognizing the needs of particularly vulnerable populations, the cultural acceptability, the life cost perspective, making the woman as the rights holder, and so on. So I think school meals for children. So I think it pushed for many things from a consumption point of view and from a food security point of view, not really from a food system point of view. So I think there's one issue there, that we don't really have legislation, like you pointed out, that you really need to take an eco-centric approach. Right now we have separate legislations for the environment or for food security and so on. But having said that, I think as part of the national pathways, I think there are countries which have started taking on board some of the points that Jennifer was mentioning, like agroecological approaches, giving incentives for the diversification of production. I think this needs to be much more systematic, at a systemic level. So far, they're just small initiatives or projects in terms of pilots. And I think really to make change and transformation, it needs to be much more systemic. But I think there are ideas on the table, so we can definitely take them and try and integrate into mainstream policy. Thank you, Hilal.
Okay, thank you. Barbara, can you make it 2 minutes?
Yes.
Any kind of your comments?
Yes, I think we need to make UN agencies more accountable. The specialized agencies in the UN system are technical agencies, ostensibly, but in fact, they are intergovernmental agencies, and they do promote their own national corporate interests in many cases. I think a stronger voice in these intergovernmental processes need to be given to civil society organizations. And maybe one development could be to give equal consideration, even though civil society organizations don't pay dues to FAO and the other specialized agencies, but to give more importance to the voices of civil society. They do have access. They are part of the Committee on World Food Security and COAG and these other bodies, but they never get a chance to speak before all the countries have spoken. And the delegations from the countries are often people from industry. So I think at that level, the UN specialized agencies, more scrutiny needs to be given.
Thank you. It's a very good point. Before giving to Shakuntala, maybe Stefanos would like to say something, because at the end, UNFCCC is going to discuss all these issues. What would be your view on that, Stefanos?
Thank you, Hilal. I think that what we need is, we have a lot of people here, we have more than 100 people. We have a lot of you from the Scientific Advisory Committee coming to the event. I think you really need to make your voice much bigger. So I must say that even from the hub, we try to do our voice bigger. I've personally done my voice bigger, although I've been criticized very much about this, but I will continue to advocate for this. So I think that's what we need. We need to stop afraid of giving a very big visibility to this issue. And I have also the feeling, and I know that there are a lot of people in this meeting and in other meetings, that they can reach up to highest levels of decision making. So, and I would encourage them, when they talk with people that they do have a leverage on decision making, to bluntly talk about these issues. Because one other thing, at least in the multilateral community and sometimes even in academia, we try to hide our goals. So instead of saying that, we have a huge problem with the concentration of power in few corporations, we say, let's face the imbalances of the food value chain. This says nothing. If we don't explicitly mention that we are talking about a dozen, I don't know, Jennifer, if it's a dozen or 2 dozens of corporations that they create the problem, if we don't pass the message this way, we will never see a solution. Because the ones that they don't want to solve the problem, they will be using this language of inclusivity to not address the problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefanos. Criticism is always good. If you do something, you get criticism. If you don't do anything, you don't get any criticism. Dan, go ahead. Very good. Thank you for Jennifer, would you like to say a word, or should I give to Shakuntala?
I would pass to Shakuntala given the time, and we have to end, I think, right on the...
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Here is your voice. Our chair of the SAC, Shakuntala, is going to wrap up our presentation.
Thank you so much, Hilal. And Jennifer, congratulations on your book. It was amazing that we were able to pull this off, and also the time that we pulled this off in order to have this webinar before we have the UNFFS +4 Stop Day. I have taken notes, so has Stephanos and many of us, and we will make sure that through the SAC and through the hub, these voices will be heard and these views will be heard when we all meet in Addis. So it's very, very opportune. Thank all of you so much. Also the speakers, the panelists, and we have collected all the questions. So we will be also working towards that. There is so much more we must do, all of us, and we must hold all food systems actors accountable and ensure that the actions to build and to trust each other, also trust between governments, the corporate sector, and also communities on the ground, that is taken into consideration as we move forward with the UN Food System Summit and we move forward to 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. For me, it is extremely important in whatever we do, no one is left behind. Thank you so much, Hilal.
Thank you. Wonderful ending. Nicole, for everything comes to you right now. You organize all these things. You put together this fantastic panel, and we are ready in the future. Whatever you organize, guys, we'll be there to help. Thank you. Thank you very much.